going to be knitting a chunky sweater. This is a walkthrough for my Ollie sweater, which is designed to be a super beginner friendly pattern. So if you've never knit a garment before, this is the pattern for you. And this pattern is for a super chunky yarn, and so you can play around with a bunch of different yarns. You can make the sweater of your dreams. So since this is a walkthrough of the Ollie sweater pattern, you are going to need the pattern itself. So you can get that on my website, my Ravelry, or my Etsy, and if you use code YouTube, you can get 15% off the pattern. Thank you so much for supporting me and my patterns, and let's get into the pattern itself. So in terms of materials, you're going to need super chunky yarn, and I really do recommend that you use super chunky yarn, or if you are going to use different yarns, to do a gauge swatch just to make sure that you like the way that that yarn turns out when you're knitting on 15mm needles. You're going to need 12 and 15mm circular needles, and they do need to be circular because you are going to be knitting in the round for quite a bit of this pattern. You're also going to need stitch markers. So today I'll be working with Wool in the Gang Heal the Wool in Golden Yolk Yellow, and it comes out in this really lovely burnt yellow color, and I really like this yarn for this pattern because it's plied so it doesn't pill as much, but obviously there's a bunch of different yarns and I have a list of suggestions too. Choosing your size. So first things first, let's choose your size. So I recommend comparing the measurements of the pattern compared to a sweater that you like the fit of, and keep in mind that this sweater is intended to be oversized and cropped. So if you want a less oversized fit, size down. If you want a longer fit, you could always add more length to the bottom. So the pattern is written in 9 sizes. It goes from extra small to 5X, and the way that you read the pattern is the very first number is for size extra small, then in parentheses, small, not in parentheses, medium, in parentheses, large, and so on and so on. And so I really recommend going through the pattern before you even start and just highlighting your size numbers, just so that you're not getting overwhelmed by all the numbers and constantly having to count to see which size is yours. And if there are ever instructions that don't have the 9 numbers, it says knit 8 rows instead of saying 8, 8, 8, 8, 8, that means that all sizes should knit 8 rows. So let's get into the pattern. First things first, you're going to knit a gauge swatch, and I really recommend doing this just because that way you know what the yarn will look like when you knit it up. You'll know if you need to size up or size down. So if you find that your tension's too big, you can always size down. If you find that your tension's too small, you can always size up, or if you like it that way, that's okay. This is a pretty forgiving pattern since it is supposed to be oversized. So you're going to cast on 8 stitches on your 15mm needles, and then you're going to knit 10 rows, and that should give you about a square of about 4 by 4 inches. So now we can actually get into knitting. So you're going to take your 12mm circular needles and you're going to cast on however many stitches you need. And I like to use a cable cast on here, but you could also use long tail cast on or provisional cast on. It's not super important. I just default to cable cast on because it's pretty stretchy, but it's super easy, and it's you're not gonna have a too long or too short of a tail, but feel free to use long tail cast on too if you want. But I find that with super bulky yarn like this, you don't really need a super stretchy cast on because the yarn itself is pretty stretchy. So we are going to create a slip knot, and the way you do that is you create a loop and then pinch the loop through, and you're just going to place that on your 12mm needles. And this is how you start cable cast on. You're going to insert as if to knit, you're going to wrap your yarn, and then you're just going to pull that stitch over and back onto the left needle. This is how you do the very first stitch. From then on, you're just going to insert your needle between the 2 stitches and then wrap your yarn and then pull it through. Insert between the 2 stitches, wrap your yarn, and pull it through. And you're just going to continue this until you have enough stitches. Once you've casted on all your stitches, you're going to join in the round. And there are a bunch of different ways to join in the round, but this is how I do it. So you're gonna wanna make sure that none of your stitches are twisted. So you just gotta make sure that nothing's twisted before you join in the round, otherwise it's a huge headache. And double checking, it's kind of tricky because these needles are a little bit small. So then you're going to take a stitch marker and put it on the side, and you're going to take a stitch from your left needle and put it on your right, then take a stitch from your right needle and pull it over that stitch and onto the left needle. That's how I join in the round. Then you're just going to place your stitch marker and you've joined in the round. Once you've joined in the round, you're going to place a stitch marker to mark the beginning of the round, and now you're going to do your 1 by 1 ribbing. So you're going to knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1 until the end of the row. And as you're working the 1 by 1 ribbing, you're going to move your working yarn back and forth, back and forth. Make sure that you're not purling with the yarn in the back, you're purling with the yarn in the front. And you might notice that the way that I'm doing it here is a little bit different, but that's because I knit continental style instead of English style. And if you're a beginner knitter, you're probably doing English style knitting, and I really recommend just finding a video to see what the difference is between those two. So ignore the fact that I'm not moving the yarn back and forth. If you're a beginner or you're knitting English style, you're going to be moving the yarn back and forth. So we are going to be working 1 by 1 ribbing. So this is a purl, and that is a knit, purl, And then you can start to see the difference between those stitches, so that the V's are a knit, the bumps are a purl. So here's an example of how you would identify what stitch is what later on. So I see that the little bump is a purl, so I'm going to purl. And then the next stitch should be a knit, and so you see the little V, and so you're going to move your yarn back, and you're going to knit the stitch. And if your ribbing is coming out a little wonky, you might be doing seed stitch, and I would recommend learning how to identify that. Once you finish your ribbing, you are going to switch to your 15mm needles, and so the way that you do that is you just start using your 15mm needles as your right needle, and you just insert and then knit as normal. And you're actually going to be working in stockinette stitch here. So that means that you're just going to be knitting the stitches. And because you're knitting in the round, you're going to just be knitting only. You're not going to be doing any pull rows. And so this is considered stockinette because it comes out to look like this. But if you were knitting flat, you would also be doing pull rows, but we'll be doing that later. So take your needle and you're just going to place your stitch marker on the side. You'll add it back later. And again, you are just going to be knitting and using your 15mm needles as the right needle. So you're just going to insert, wrap, knit, and now all your stitches are going to be transferred to your 15mm needles. So you're going to be working on the bottom here, so this is everything that's underneath the armpit. So if you want a longer sweater than what's said in the pattern, I recommend adding length here. Once you finish adding length to the bottom, you're going to divide for the front and the back panels. So first we're going to work on the back, and you're actually going to be knitting flat at this part. So you're going to be knitting the stitches of the back only, and then leaving these stitches for the front on hold. You can also leave them on another piece of yarn or another set of needles, and instead of continue to knit all the way around, you're actually going to turn your work and start purling across the stitches of the back only. Here we have the stitches for the back, and we're just going to turn our work, and we are just going to start purling across those stitches for the back, and stitches for the back only. And so insert your needle and purl. And this is knitting stockinette flat. And now you'll be working stockinette flat, so that means you're going to be knitting one row, then purling one row, knitting one row, purling one row. And once you've reached the indicated length, you're actually going to start shaping the neckline. To shape the neckline, you're going to knit the indicated number of stitches and cast off the middle stitches, then knit the number of stitches. And this will divide the back panel between the back left shoulder and the back right shoulder, or the back right shoulder, back left shoulder. Once you've cast it off, you're just going to continue to shape the shoulders, and once you're done, you're going to cut your yarn and make sure it's actually cut. And you're just going to pass the tail through that last stitch so it doesn't come unraveled. And you're just going to leave these stitches on hold until you finish working on the front. You're going to reattach your yarn to these stitches for the front. And you're going to be shaping the front panel, but that's going to be pretty similar to how you shape the back panel. In order to reattach your yarn to these stitches of the front, you're just going to need your yarn and your needle and your stitches. So you're going to insert your needle, you're going to take your yarn and just loop it over the needle as if it's already attached. And then you'll just knit as normal, and that is how you reattach your yarn. And so once you finish shaping the stitches for the front shoulders, you are now going to use 3 needle bind off to seam together the shoulders. So first things first, you're going to want to turn your work inside out so that the right sides are facing one another. And you're also going to want to use your 12mm needles as the third needle here, because it's a 3 needle bind off. And so once the right sides are facing one another, you're going to have the stitches for the shoulders. Make sure that it's the stitches for the back left shoulder and the front left shoulder are together, or the back right shoulder and the front right shoulder. And you are just going to want to make sure that the edges of both stitches are available, so you might have to move some things around. But once all your stitches are aligned, you're just going to take your third needle and insert it into one stitch from the front and one stitch from the back. You're going to wrap your yarn and then pull that stitch through both of those stitches. And then you're just going to repeat that step, so one stitch from the front and one stitch from the back, wrap your yarn, pull it through both, and then you're just going to cast off that stitch. And you're just going to repeat this until you have no stitches left, or you have one stitch left, and then you're just going to cut your yarn and pass it through that one stitch. Here we've done 3 needle bind off until we've had only one stitch left, and we're just going to cut the yarn and pass through that tail. And 3 needle bind off gives you this really nice clean seam. And just repeat this for the other shoulder. You could also cast off all the stitches for the shoulders and then use mattress stitch to join together the shoulders, but I prefer 3 needle bind off. So at this point you should have finished the body of the sweater, and so feel free to try it on. You could have kind of tried it on before, but like you wouldn't have recognized it as a sweater. So now you just have like a nice box for your sweater. And this is what your sweater should look like at this point, a nice box for you to try on, but it looks kind of like a sweater. Next, we'll be working on the sleeves, and so you're going to take your 15mm needles and you're going to pick up stitches all around the armholes. And if you want bigger sleeves, you can always pick up more stitches than what's in the pattern. If you want smaller sleeves, you can always pick up less. I would just recommend that you make sure that the number of stitches that you're picking up is even and also divides to be an even number. So you're just going to take your 15mm needles and your yarn, and you're just going to insert the needle into the bottom of the armpit. And then you're just going to wrap your yarn as if you're already knitting, and then just pull that stitch through to the other side. And you'll just repeat this, picking up stitches as you go. And I recommend picking up stitches between the V's of each stitch and about 1 column in from the edge just for a neater seam, and also making sure that you're picking up the stitches from the same column if you're going up a straight line. So once you've picked up the stitches for the sleeves, you're going to place a stitch marker at the beginning of the round, and you're just going to knit and stockinette in the round until you've added enough length for your sleeves. And I really do recommend trying it on here just to see like how long your arms are. And keep in mind that adding the ribbing at the bottom adds about 3 inches. So now we have all the stitches picked up, and we are just going to place a stitch marker and begin knitting in the round. And if you find that your cord is too long for all the stitches, I really recommend doing the magic loop method, which is why I pulled that one needle as far out as I could. And during your first stitch, I recommend just holding on to that tail just so that you don't accidentally pull the stitch off to the other side. And now we're just knitting in the round and adding length. And here we are trying on the sweater, and we're at about the right length for me. Once you've added enough length for the sleeves, you're now going to do a decrease round. So you're going to knit 2 together all across the sleeve, and this will decrease the number of stitches you have by half. To knit 2 together, you're just going to take your needle, insert it into 2 stitches, wrap your yarn, and pull that stitch through both stitches. And you're just going to repeat this to the end of the round, and this is decreasing the number of stitches you have by half. Once you've decreased the right number of stitches, you're going to take your 12mm needles and you're going to start doing your 1x1 ribbing again. So again, that's knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1 to the end of the row. Once you've done all the ribbing for the cuff, you're just going to cast off and pattern. So that means you're going to knit 1, purl 1, then cast off 1 stitch, then knit 1, cast off 1 stitch, purl 1, cast off 1 stitch until the end of the row. So we are just going to cast off and pattern here, and so we're just going to knit 1, then purl 1, and then cast off 1 stitch. And then we knit 1, cast off 1 stitch, and so on. So with our last stitch, we're just going to cut a tail and then pass it through the last stitch. And if you notice that there's a little bit of a gap between the first and the last stitch, this is how I like to fix it. So take the tail and thread it through a needle. And this is tricky because it's super chunky yarn, but I promise you'll get it. And you're just going to insert your needle through the top V of the first stitch and then pull it through. And then you're just going to insert your needle through the top V of the last stitch and then pull it through. And make sure you're not pulling too tight because otherwise it makes it obvious. But yeah, that's how you clean up that edge. Okay, now you're done with one sleeve, and just repeat all those steps for the other sleeve. And now you're almost done with your sweater. Now all you have to do is the neckband. And so I like to make it so that it's a higher neckband, so it's kind of like a mock neck / turtleneck. You can always do less rows of ribbing to give yourself a crew neck. But first things first, we gotta use our 12mm needles to pick up these stitches for the neckband. So use your 12mm needles and pick up these stitches for the neckband. I like to pick up stitches starting at the back left, moving across the front, and then going around the back, and just making sure that you're moving counterclockwise? Clockwise? I think it's clockwise. Once you've picked up all the stitches for the neckband, you're just going to place a stitch marker to mark the beginning of the round, and you're going to do 1x1 ribbing. So again, here I like to do about 5 rows for more of a mock neck, but you can always do less if you want more of a crew neck. I also like to pick up stitches a few rows down from the cast off edge just to give it more of like a comfortable fit. And you can always pick up higher, but I recommend doing a little bit lower. Now we're picking up stitches for the neckband, so we're going to start at the back left shoulder, and we're just going to use our 12mm needles. And we're just going to take our yarn, and we're going to insert our needle into the neck. And I recommend picking up stitches about 1 to 2 columns in, just for a neater edge. And you're just going to start picking up stitches moving across the front and then across the back. And again, for a slightly more comfortable fit, I recommend picking up a few rows down or a few columns in. Now we'll just place a stitch marker at the beginning of the row, and we'll just start knitting 1x1 ribbing, which you should be pretty familiar with. And so you're just going to knit one, purl one, knit one, purl one to the end of the row. Once you've done your desired number of rows of ribbing, you're going to cast off loosely in ribbing. You could always do a tubular bind off here as well if you want to stretch your cast off edge, but I find, again, that with super bulky yarn, it's pretty forgiving and pretty stretchy. And that is the entire Ollie sweater. Hopefully it didn't take too long. It's a super bulky knit, so it whips up pretty quickly and it looks so cute afterwards. And I'm really excited to see all the things that you guys have created. Hopefully that wasn't too bad to knit. If you have any other questions, feel free to reach out to me or leave a comment. Thank you so much for supporting me and my patterns. Hope you have a lovely rest of your day. Happy knitting and see ya.